Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
I had lived in my end-unit townhouse on Callaway Court for 6 years, and in that time, I had made it my business to keep the little walking path outside my front door as clean and welcoming as the day I moved in. The path curved around the corner of the building in that particular way that older Los Angeles neighborhoods sometimes managed, lined with birds of paradise and a low row of trimmed boxwood that the landscapers maintained on Thursdays. My front door opened directly onto that path, and 30 feet to the left sat my garage. It was not a long walk, but it was my walk, and in 6 years I had never once walked it without feeling grateful that I lived here. I had come home on a Tuesday evening in mid-October, groceries in both arms, the sun still hanging low and warm the way it does in LA when the rest of the country is already pulling out sweaters. I turned the corner onto the path the way I always did, barely thinking about it, and then I stopped dead. There was something on my garage wall that had not been there that morning. Something large and metal and entirely wrong, bolted directly into the stucco at eye level, catching the last of the afternoon light in a way that made it impossible to miss or ignore or pretend was not exactly what it was. I set my groceries down on the path and walked up close enough to read it. The sign was roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, heavy gauge metal with dark aggressive lettering, the kind of thing you might see bolted to a utility fence in an industrial neighborhood. The vast majority of the text was in Spanish. There was a single line of English printed smaller along the bottom that read "No trash picking," as though that were a perfectly reasonable thing to bolt onto someone's home without so much as a courtesy call. I pulled out my phone and ran the Spanish through Google Translate right there on the path, and what came back told me that anyone walking by was being informed they were forbidden from going through the bins, that they were trespassing on private property, and that the police would be called. It was hostile and presumptuous, and carried the clear implication that whoever was likely to cause this particular problem was someone who read Spanish and not English. I read it twice and felt the anger start low in my chest and work its way steadily outward. My neighbor Carol Simmons came around the corner just then, walking her small tan dog the way she did every evening around that time. She slowed when she saw me standing there staring at my garage wall, and then she saw the sign and slowed further, and then she stopped entirely. "Dana, what on earth is that thing?" Carol said, and it was not really a question so much as an expression of shared disbelief. "That is what I am currently trying to figure out," I told her. "I came home 20 minutes ago and found it bolted to my wall. Nobody called me, nobody left a note, nobody sent so much as an email warning me it was coming." Carol stepped closer and read the English line at the bottom, then looked at the rest of it. "Why is it in Spanish?" she asked. "Apparently the board has decided that anyone going through the recycling bins speaks Spanish and not English," I said. "Which tells you quite a lot about what the board thinks of Spanish-speaking people." Carol shook her head slowly in the way that people do when something confirms a suspicion they already had. "Deanne Platt," she said, as though that explained everything, and honestly it did explain quite a lot. "That would be my guess," I said. "I'm going to call the HOA office in the morning and find out exactly when this was voted on and approved, because I have read my CC and RS twice, and I cannot find a single line that gives them the right to bolt anything permanently onto my garage wall." Carol looked at the sign again, and then looked at me with genuine sympathy. "Good luck getting anyone on the phone over there," she said. "I called them 3 times in September about the broken gate latch and got put on hold until I gave up. Walter finally just fixed it himself." I took photographs of the sign from every angle before I went inside, making sure to capture how it faced the walking path and not the alley, and making sure the bolt placement was clearly documented. Then I went in and wrote a detailed and carefully worded email to the board, and sent it before I talked myself into making it more heated than it needed to be at that stage. The next morning I called the HOA management office at 9 o'clock sharp. The phone rang 4 times, and then a recorded voice informed me that my call was very important and that someone would be with me shortly. I listened to 40 seconds of instrumental music that might have been a slowed-down version of something I recognized, and then the music stopped and the recording came back, and told me again that my call was very important. I waited. The music returned. I stood in my kitchen drinking coffee and waiting, and after 11 minutes a woman answered with a flat and practiced brightness that suggested she had answered this phone a great many times and found very little of it rewarding. Callaway Court HOA Management, this is Stephanie. How can I help you today? She said. Good morning, Stephanie. My name is Dana Mercer. I'm a homeowner at Unit 14 on Callaway Court, and I'm calling because I came home yesterday to find a large metal sign that has been bolted onto my garage wall without any prior notice or approval from me, and I need to speak with someone on the board about it, I said. Okay, I can take a message and have someone return your call, Stephanie said. I also sent an email to the board yesterday evening and haven't received any response, I told her. Is there someone I can speak with directly today? The board members aren't available by direct call, but I can absolutely pass your message along and someone will get back to you, she said, with the particular tone of someone who has made this promise many times without significant follow-through. Can you tell me when the installation of this sign was voted on and approved by the board? I asked. There was a brief pause. I wouldn't have that information in front of me, but I can look into it and include that in the message, she said. I would appreciate that very much, I said, and gave her my number even though she already had it on file and thanked her and hung up. By that afternoon, I had heard nothing. I ran into my other neighbor, Pete Garland, coming back from the mailboxes, and he stopped when he saw me and pointed at the sign with the expression of a man who had been wanting to say something about it since he first noticed it. Tell me you didn't put that thing up yourself, Pete said. I absolutely did not, I told him. The board installed it without telling me. I came home and there it was. Pete looked at it for a long moment, leaning slightly forward the way he did when he was thinking something through. They bolted it into your stucco, he said. That's your stucco, Dana. That's not a common wall, that's your unit. I know that, I said. And I have read the CC and RS front to back, and there is nothing in there that gives them the right to do this. Nothing. The whole thing in Spanish is something else, Pete said, shaking his head. My wife saw it this morning and asked me who put up the sign, assuming everyone around here is Mexican. I didn't have a good answer for her. Nobody has a good answer for it, I said. Because there isn't one. I called the HOA office again the following morning and was placed on hold within 30 seconds of identifying myself. I waited for 7 minutes before the line disconnected. I called back and reached a different person who told me Stephanie was unavailable, but that she would make sure my message was passed along, and that someone from the board would be in touch very soon. Very soon turned out to mean nothing at all. 2 more days passed. I sent a second email, this one slightly less measured in tone than the first, asking specifically which section of the CC and RS authorized permanent signage on individually owned exterior surfaces, and requesting the minutes from whatever board meeting had approved this installation. I received an automated reply, confirming my email had been received. On the 6th day, I ran into Carol again on the path, and she asked me if I had heard anything, and I told her I had not. You know what Diane Platt told Margaret Okonkwo last year when Margaret asked about repainting her front door, Carol said, stopping and turning to face me fully. She told her that all exterior surfaces were subject to board approval, and that the board's decisions on exterior appearance were final. Margaret wanted to paint her door a slightly different shade of the same color, and Diane acted like she was proposing to put up a circus tent. So exterior surfaces require board approval when a homeowner wants to change something, I said slowly, but not when the board wants to bolt a metal sign onto them. Apparently not, Carol said, and the two of us stood there for a moment in the particular silence of people who have arrived at an obvious and infuriating conclusion. On the 8th day, I went out in the early evening with a screwdriver and a patch kit, and I took the sign down myself. I worked carefully and without hurrying, patching each bolt hole cleanly before I moved on to the next. I was going to pick up matching paint in the morning. I carried the sign inside and stood it against my entryway wall because it was their property, and I had every intention of returning it. I was not throwing it away, I was not destroying it, I was removing it from a surface it had no legal right to occupy, and I was prepared to say exactly that to anyone who wanted to have that conversation. I looked at my garage wall when I was done, smooth and clean the way it was supposed to be, and I felt completely certain I had done the right thing. What I also felt, standing there in the quiet of the October evening, was that the conversation was only just beginning. I picked up the matching paint at the hardware store first thing Wednesday morning, a small can of the exact beige that matched the stucco on my garage wall, and I had the patched holes covered and blended before 9 o'clock. I stood back and looked at it in the morning light, and it was as though the sign had never been there at all, which was precisely the point. I took photographs of the finished wall the same way a contractor documents completed work, methodical and thorough, because something told me I was going to need them before this was over. I carried the sign out to my car and drove the 4 blocks to the HO, a management office on Ventura, which occupied a small suite between a nail salon and an insurance agency in a strip mall that had seen better decades. I walked in with the sign under my arm and set it on the counter in front of a young woman with a headset around her neck who looked at the sign, and then looked at me with the careful expression of someone calculating how much trouble this was going to be for her personally. "I need to return this to the board," I told her pleasantly. "It was installed on my property without my knowledge or consent, and I have removed it. I want it on record that I am returning it intact and undamaged, and I would like something in writing acknowledging that." The young woman, whose nameplate identified her as Brittany, looked at the sign and then looked back at me. "I'm not really sure I'm able to accept this," she said. "You don't need to accept it in any official capacity," I told her, keeping my voice calm and friendly. "I'm simply returning their property to the people responsible for it. If you'd prefer, I'm happy to wait here until someone from the board arrives to take it personally, but I have to be honest with you, I have a fairly flexible schedule today." Brittany picked up her phone and had a brief and quiet conversation with someone I couldn't identify, and then she hung up and looked at me with the expression of someone who had been given instructions she didn't entirely agree with. "I can hold it here until I hear from the board," she said. "That works perfectly," I said. "And I'll need you to write down on office letterhead that Dana Mercer of Unit 14 returned one metal sign to this office today in undamaged condition." I smiled at her. "Just the facts, nothing editorial." She hesitated for just a moment, and then wrote it out on a sheet of paper with the management company letterhead at the top, and I took a photograph of it with my phone before I folded it carefully and put it in my purse. I thanked Brittany sincerely, because none of this was her fault, and I drove home feeling like I had handled the morning about as well as it could have been handled. Carol was out front watering her potted plants when I pulled in, and she waved me over with the particular urgency of someone who had been waiting to talk. "I saw you taking that sign down last night," she said, lowering her voice slightly out of habit even though there was nobody within earshot. "Walter and I watched from the window. We were rooting for you for what it's worth." "I appreciate that more than you know," I told her. "I just came back from dropping it off at the management office. I have it in writing that I returned it in perfect condition." Carol nodded approvingly. "Smart," she said. "You document everything with these people. The minute you don't have something in writing, they'll tell you the conversation never happened." She set her watering can down and looked at me seriously. "Dana, you know Diane is not going to let this go quietly. That woman has never backed down from anything in the 4 years she's been on that board." "I know," I said. "But I've read the CC and RS twice now, and there is nothing in there that gives them the right to do what they did." "Nothing. My garage wall is my property, and they treated it like a bulletin board." "And the Spanish business," Carol said, shaking her head. "My sister-in-law came to visit last weekend and saw that sign, and asked me if there was some kind of problem in the neighborhood with gangs. That is the impression that sign gives to people who don't know better." "That's exactly the problem," I said. "It doesn't just look tacky, it makes the whole community look like somewhere you need to be warned away from. It implies there are threatening people coming around, which there aren't, and it implies those threatening people are Spanish-speaking, which is a whole other level of offensive." Carol picked her watering can back up and sighed. "You let me know if there is anything Walter and I can do," she said. "We have lived here 11 years, and we have never liked the direction Diane has taken this board. You might be the person who finally does something about it." I thanked her and went inside and got on with my day. And for about 48 hours things were quiet enough that I almost let myself believe the board might simply decide the whole situation wasn't worth pursuing. That was naive of me, and I knew it even at the time. But optimism is a difficult habit to break entirely. The certified letter arrived Friday afternoon, and I knew before I opened it that it was not going to contain anything resembling an apology or a concession. It was printed on board letterhead and signed by Deanne Platt in her capacity as president, and it informed me in language that was equal parts bureaucratic and contemptuous that I had been found in violation of Section 7.4 of the Community Rules, which covered the removal and destruction of association property, and Section 12.1, which covered unauthorized alterations to common area surfaces. The fine was $450, payable within 30 days, with a note at the bottom warning that failure to pay could result in additional fines and potential liens against my property. I read it standing at my front door, and then I went inside and sat down and read it again at the kitchen table. Section 7.4 said nothing that applied to my situation because I had not destroyed anything. I had removed a sign from my own property and returned it in perfect condition with written documentation of the return. Section 12.1 referred to common area surfaces, and my garage wall was not a common area surface under any reasonable reading of the governing documents. They were fining me using sections that did not describe what I had actually done, which meant either that they had not read their own rules with any care, or that they were banking on me not having read them either. Neither possibility reflected particularly well on them. I called Pete Garland because I needed to say what I was thinking out loud to someone who would understand it. $450, Pete said, and the pause that followed had a particular quality to it that suggested he was choosing his next words carefully. "Dana, that is not a fine, that is a message. They are telling you that pushing back costs money, and they are hoping you decide it costs more than it's worth." "They cited destruction of property," I told him. "I have written documentation from their own management office that I returned the sign undamaged." "Of course you do," Pete said, "because you're smarter than they are and you knew this was coming." "What sections did they cite?" I read them to him, and he was quiet for a moment. 7.4 is about the pool signs, he said. That section exists because of the liability notices around the pool area. It has nothing to do with a sign on a private garage wall. "That's exactly right," I said. "And 12.1 covers common area surfaces, which my garage wall is not." "They know that," Pete said, and his voice had gone from surprise to something flatter and more certain. "They are not confused about this, Dana. They are counting on you being confused about it, or intimidated by it, or just tired enough to write the check and move on." "I'm none of those things," I said. "No," Pete agreed. "You are not." He paused again. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to respond to this letter in writing, formally dispute the fine, cite the specific sections they got wrong, and request a meeting with the board," I said. "I want to sit across from them and give them the chance to explain their reasoning to my face before I decide what comes after that." "You're being more generous than I would be," Pete said. "Maybe," I said. "But I want to do this the right way. I want every step I take to be reasonable and documented and unimpeachable, because at some point someone else is going to be looking at all of this, and I want it to be absolutely clear who behaved well in this situation and who did not." Pete was quiet for a moment. "You know, my wife Maria has been talking to a few of the other neighbors about this," he said. "The Nuyens and the Castellanos and the Holt family. None of them are happy about the sign, and the Castellanos in particular took the Spanish language thing very personally. Rosa told Maria that she felt like the board was pointing a finger at her family specifically. That landed somewhere uncomfortable in my chest. I intend to raise the racial dimension of this directly when I meet with the board," I said. "It needs to be said plainly and on the record." "Good," Pete said simply. "And Dana, for whatever it's worth, if you need people to stand behind you on this, you've got them." I spent the rest of that evening writing my formal response to the fine notice. I disputed the citation of Section 7.4 on the grounds that I had returned the sign undamaged and had written documentation of the return, and I disputed the citation of Section 12.1 on the grounds that the exterior wall of an individually owned end-unit garage did not meet the definition of a common area surface under the governing documents. I kept the language precise and unemotional, and I cited specific page numbers. I sent it by email and printed a copy to drop at the management office in the morning. Then I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my patio in the warm evening air and thought about how much I had enjoyed living on Callaway Court for 6 years, and how little I had ever imagined I would one day be sitting here drafting legal disputes with the people supposedly responsible for maintaining the quality of this community. The path outside my front door was quiet and clean and well lit the way it always was at this hour, and my garage wall was smooth and unmarked and exactly the way it belonged. The fine notice was still sitting on my kitchen table. $450 for taking down a sign that should never have gone up in the first place, on a wall they had no right to touch, written in a language chosen to single out an entire group of people as presumptive criminals. I was not going to pay it. I was not going to let it go. And I was becoming increasingly certain that before this was finished, Diane Platt and the rest of that board were going to wish they had simply picked up the phone and called me before they ever picked up that drill. I had requested the meeting in writing, the same way I did everything that involved this board, and Gerald Fitch had responded within a day confirming Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock in the community room. That response time alone told me something. For 6 days after my initial complaint about the sign, they had managed to say nothing whatsoever, and yet a meeting request following a formal fine dispute produced a confirmation inside 24 hours. Diane Platt wanted this meeting on her terms and in her space, and she wanted it soon. That was fine with me. I had things to say that I was entirely prepared to say in any room she chose. I spent the weekend before the meeting going through my materials until I knew them well enough to find any page without looking. I had my deed, printed from the county assessor's records, which showed the precise legal boundaries of my unit. I had my CC and RS with 3 colors of highlighting, each color representing a different category of argument. I had my photographs, printed in color on good paper, showing the sign on my wall, the angle it faced, the bolt placement, and the finished repair. I had the fine notice and my written dispute of it, and I had the signed note from Brittany at the management office confirming the return of the sign in undamaged condition. I put everything in a clean folder in the order I expected to need it, and I set it by my front door so I would not forget it. Carol stopped me on the path Monday morning and asked if I was ready. As ready as I'm going to be, I told her. Remember that Diane will try to control the whole thing from the moment you walk in, Carol said, with the certainty of someone who had watched this happen to other people. She'll have her talking points prepared, and she'll run through them whether you're finished speaking or not. Don't let her do that to you. I don't intend to, I said. And Walt Crummer, Carol said, lowering her voice slightly even though we were alone on the path. Walt is not a bad person. He's just not a person who likes conflict, which means he goes along with whatever Diane says because agreeing with Diane is the path of least resistance. But I have spoken to Walt privately about this sign business, and he is not comfortable with it. If you can get him to actually say something in that room, it might matter. I filed that away and thanked her, and on Tuesday evening I dressed carefully and arrived at the community room at exactly 7 o'clock with my folder under my arm. They were already seated when I walked in, all 4 of them arranged along one side of the long folding table the way people arrange themselves when they want you to feel like you are appearing before a panel, rather than having a conversation. Diane Platt sat in the center with her reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a legal pad in front of her. Gerald Fitch sat to her right with a laptop open and his fingers already resting on the keyboard. Ron Busby sat to her left with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had already decided how this was going to go. Walt Crummer sat at the far end, slightly apart from the others, looking at the table in front of him. There was one chair on my side. I sat down, placed my folder on the table, and looked at Diane. "Thank you all for making time to meet with me," I said. "Of course," Diane said warmly, in the particular tone of warmth that does not reach the eyes. "The board always makes time for homeowner concerns. That's what we're here for." Then I'm sure this will be a productive conversation, I said. I'd like to start with a straightforward question. Can someone point me to the specific section of our CC and RS that authorizes the board to permanently install signage on the exterior wall of my garage? Diane did not even glance at a document. The exterior surfaces of townhouse units in a common interest development are considered shared property under California Civil Code, she said, with the practiced fluency of someone reciting something they had rehearsed. The association has broad authority to maintain and utilize those surfaces for the benefit of the community. I'm familiar with California Civil Code as it applies to common interest developments, I said, opening my folder. I'm asking specifically about our governing documents. Our CC and RS require homeowners to submit written requests for board approval before making any changes to exterior surfaces. I found the page and turned it to face her. I have done that myself, multiple times, for changes far less permanent than bolting metal hardware into stucco. Are you telling me that the board operates under a different standard than the homeowners it represents? The board acts on behalf of the entire community, Ron Busby said, uncrossing and recrossing his arms. We have to make decisions that serve the greater good, and sometimes that means acting efficiently rather than going through a lengthy approval process for every little thing. Permanently altering the exterior surface of someone's private residence is not a little thing, Ron, I said, looking at him directly. The exterior of your unit is not entirely private, Gerald Fitch said, reading from something on his screen. In attached housing, exterior walls serve the community as a whole and are subject to association oversight. Subject to oversight is not the same as available for the board's use, I said. I found my deed and slid it across the table. These are my property boundaries, as recorded with the county assessor. The exterior wall of my garage falls within them. I would be interested to see the document that contradicts this. Diane looked at the deed without touching it. The way someone looks at something they have decided in advance is irrelevant. The sign was installed for the safety and cleanliness of the community, she said, pivoting away from the legal question with the smoothness of long practice. There have been ongoing issues with individuals accessing the trash bins, and the board determined that clear signage was the appropriate response. I have lived at Unit 14 for 6 years, I said. I have never once had an issue with anyone accessing my trash bins. I was not consulted, not notified, and not given any opportunity to weigh in before a permanent metal fixture was drilled into my home. Can you help me understand why my input was not considered relevant? Homeowner input is always valued, Diane said, in a tone that communicated precisely the opposite. But the board has the authority and the responsibility to act when community standards are at risk, and we cannot always wait for individual approval before addressing a community-wide concern. A concern that apparently required a sign written almost entirely in Spanish, I said, and I let that sit in the room for a moment before I continued. I would like to address that directly, because I think it deserves a direct conversation. I found my printed photograph of the sign and placed it on the table facing them. This sign faces the walking path that leads to my front door and to the front doors of several of my neighbors. It is written in one language. The message that sends, whether it was intended or not, is that the people this board considers a threat to our community are Spanish-speaking people. I have neighbors on this path whose families speak Spanish as a first language, and this sign points a finger at them every single day. The room was quiet. Walt Crummer looked up from the table for the first time since I had sat down, and something moved across his face that was not quite agreement, but was close enough to discomfort that it was visible. The sign is informational, Diane said, after a pause that was just slightly too long. It communicates community policy regarding the trash bins. The language was chosen based on the board's assessment of the situation. The board's assessment that the people causing the problem speak Spanish, I said. The board's assessment of the most effective way to communicate the policy, Diane said, and her jaw had tightened in a way that told me I had touched something she did not enjoy being touched. I'd like to hear from the other board members, I said, looking down the table. Gerald, do you believe that singling out one language group as the presumptive source of a community problem is an appropriate use of the board's authority? Gerald Fitch looked at his laptop screen. The board made a collective decision, he said carefully. I support the board's decision. Ron, I said. Signs are put up in Spanish all over Los Angeles, Ron Busby said, with the energy of someone who believes they have just made an excellent point. It's the most commonly spoken language in this part of the city after English. There's nothing unusual about it. A sign in a business district informing the public of hours or policies is not the same thing as a sign on a private home warning a specific language group that the police will be called, I said. I think you know that, Ron. Ron Busby opened his mouth and then closed it again. I looked at Walt Crummer. Walt, I said, do you have anything you'd like to add? Walt looked at me and then looked at Diane and then looked back at the table. I think, he began and then stopped. Diane's eyes moved to him with the focused attention of someone monitoring a potential problem. I think the concerns being raised are worth considering, he said finally, quietly enough that it landed without force. The board has considered them, Diane said immediately, closing that door before it could open further. And the board's position remains unchanged. The fine assessed against Unit 14 stands. The sign was association property, its removal was unauthorized, and the assessment was made in accordance with community rules. It was made in accordance with sections that do not describe what I actually did, I said, finding my dispute letter and placing it in front of her. Section 7.4 pertains to signage around the pool area, which exists for liability reasons specific to that location. I did not remove a pool sign. Section 12.1 pertains to common area surfaces, and my garage wall does not meet the definition of a common area surface under our governing documents. I have laid all of this out in writing, and I would like the board to address it specifically rather than generally. Diane looked at the letter. The board's legal interpretation of the governing documents is final in matters of community governance, she said. If you disagree with the assessment, you are entitled to submit a written appeal within 30 days. I am submitting one right now, I said. In person, in front of all of you. Appeals are reviewed at the board's next scheduled meeting, Gerald Fitch said, reading from his screen again. And when is that? I asked. 6 weeks from this Thursday, he said. I looked at all of them in turn, taking my time. Diane with her legal pad and her reading glasses, and her absolute certainty that she was right about everything. Gerald with his laptop and his careful neutrality. Ron with his crossed arms and his diminishing confidence. Walt with his eyes back on the table, and whatever it was that he was unwilling to say out loud. I want to make sure I understand the board's position clearly before I leave, I said. The board's position is that it has the authority to permanently install signage on the exterior wall of my privately owned garage without notice, without consent, and without any specific provision in the CC and RS authorizing it to do so. The board's position is that a fine of $450 assessed against me for returning that sign undamaged is valid and will not be reconsidered. And the board's position is that a sign written in a single language and directed at a specific ethnic group raises no concerns worth discussing. The board's position, Diane said, meeting my eyes with the serene confidence of someone who has never lost an argument because she has never allowed one to conclude against her, is that the board acted appropriately, within its authority, and in the best interests of this community. All right, I said. I closed my folder and picked it up and stood. Thank you all for your time this evening. I said goodnight to each of them by name, including Walt Crummer, who looked up when I said his name and held my gaze for just a moment longer than necessary, long enough that I thought I understood something about where he stood that he was not yet willing to say out loud. I walked out of the community room into the warm night air and stood in the parking lot and breathed slowly and thought about what I had just learned. I had learned that Diane Platt was not going to move. I had learned that Gerald Fitch and Ron Busby would follow her wherever she led. I had learned that Walt Crummer had a conscience that was currently losing a battle with his conflict aversion. And I had learned that the board had no specific legal authority for what they had done and knew it, because not one of them had been able to point me to a single line in the CC and RS that said otherwise. I drove home and walked the path to my front door and looked at my clean garage wall in the glow of the path lighting, and I thought about what came next. The board had 6 weeks before my appeal reached their table. I had 6 weeks to decide how I wanted to use them. Standing there in the quiet of that October night, I was already fairly certain that the next step was going to involve someone with a law degree, and that the meeting I had just left was going to look, in retrospect, like the last opportunity anyone on that board had to resolve this with any dignity at all. The 6 weeks between the private meeting and the full HO meeting were not quiet ones. A second notice arrived from the management office 2 weeks after my meeting with the board, this one informing me that because I had not paid the original $450 fine within the 30-day window, a late fee of $75 had been added to my account, bringing my total balance to $525. The notice had the same bureaucratic coldness as the first one, and was signed, as always, by Deanne Platt. I photographed it, added it to my folder, and did not write a check. A third notice arrived 10 days after that, this one adding another administrative processing fee of $50, which brought the total to $575. There was a paragraph at the bottom, written in slightly larger text than the rest of the letter, reminding me that unpaid balances could be reported to credit agencies and that the association reserved the right to place a lien on my property. I read that paragraph twice, put the notice in my folder with the others, and called Pete. "They're stacking fees on top of the original fine," I told him. "It started at $450, and it's at $575 now and climbing." "Of course it is," Pete said, without any surprise in his voice whatsoever. "That's the game, Dana. They fine you, you don't pay, they add fees, the number gets bigger, and at some point they're betting you decide it's cheaper to just pay it and move on than to keep fighting it." "What they're actually doing is building my case for me," I said. "Every notice they send, every fee they add without any additional justification, goes straight into my folder." "Have you talked to anyone else about the HO meeting?" Pete asked. "Because Maria has been talking to the neighbors, and there are more people than you might think who want to say something publicly. I've spoken to Carol and Walter, and Rosa Castellano called me last week," I said. "Rosa told me that her mother, who speaks very little English, saw that sign when she was visiting and was genuinely upset by it. She thought the residents of this community had put it up specifically to make people like her feel unwelcome." Pete was quiet for a moment. "That needs to be said at that meeting," he said. "Exactly like that. I've asked Rosa if she'd be willing to speak," I told him. "She said she would think about it. I'm not going to pressure her." "What about the Nuyens?" he asked. "David Nuyen sent me an email last week saying he and his wife would be there," I said. "He was careful about what he put in writing, but he made it clear they support what I'm doing." Over the following weeks I spoke to 7 of my neighbors in total, some briefly and some at length, and by the time the HO meeting arrived, I had a reasonable sense of who would show up and who would be there in spirit but preferred to stay home. I understood both positions. Taking on a homeowners association board in a public forum was not something everyone had the appetite for, and I was not going to judge anyone for calculating their own risk. What I knew was that I would not be walking into that room alone, and that mattered more than the exact head count. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the community room, the same room where I had sat across the folding table from the board 6 weeks earlier, though tonight it was arranged differently with rows of chairs facing a table at the front where the board sat. I arrived early enough to get a seat in the second row and to watch the room fill up around me. Carol and Walter came in together and sat beside me. Pete and Maria Garland sat directly behind me. Rosa Castellano came in with her husband Eddie, and they took seats to my left. David and Jenny Nguyen settled in near the back. There were other residents there too, some of whom I knew well and some only by sight, and the room had the particular charged energy of a space where people have come because they feel something has gone wrong and they want to see it addressed. The board filed in at 7 o'clock and took their seats at the front table in the same arrangement as always, Diane in the center, Gerald to her right, Ron to her left, Walt at the end. Diane surveyed the room with the expression of a woman who had noted the unusually high attendance and was already composing her response to it. She called the meeting to order, ran through the procedural opening that was apparently required, and then moved briskly into the agenda as though the room full of unusually attentive homeowners was nothing she needed to address directly. The agenda items before the open forum portion of the meeting took 40 minutes to get through, and they were 40 minutes of the particular tedium that a meeting specialize in: landscaping contracts and parking enforcement updates, and a discussion about whether the pool hours should be adjusted for the winter months. I sat with my folder in my lap and waited. I could feel the attention in the room shifting and resettling the way it does when people are waiting for the part that actually matters. When Diane announced the open forum portion and asked if any homeowners had items they wished to raise, I raised my hand before she had finished the sentence. "Dana Mercer, Unit 14, I said, standing up. "I'd like to address the board regarding the fine currently on my account, the additional fees that have been added to that fine, and the circumstances that led to all of it." Diane looked at me with an expression of polite sufferance. "You have 5 minutes, Dana," she said. "I'll try to be concise," I said, and opened my folder. 6 weeks ago, the board installed a large metal sign on the exterior wall of my garage without providing me with any prior notice, without conducting a homeowner vote, and without citing any specific provision of our CC and RS that authorized them to do so. I removed the sign, returned it to the management office in undamaged condition with written documentation of the return, and submitted a formal written dispute of the fine that was subsequently issued against me. I paused and looked at the board. In the 6 weeks since then, I have received 2 additional fee notices, bringing my total balance from $450 to $575. I have not paid any portion of this balance because I do not believe any portion of it is legally valid, and I am here tonight to explain why in front of this community. "The fine was issued in accordance with community rules," Diane said, as though that settled the matter. "I'd like to finish before the board responds," I said pleasantly, and turned back to face the room as much as the board. Section 7.4 of our CC and RS, which the fine notice cited, pertains specifically to signage in the pool area. It was written to address liability notices required by California law in residential pool facilities. I did not remove a pool sign. I removed a sign from my privately owned garage wall, which is an entirely different thing, and the board's application of this section to my situation is not supported by the plain language of the document. I found the page and held it up. Section 12.1, which was also cited, refers to common area surfaces. The exterior wall of an end-unit garage within the legal boundaries of a privately owned townhouse unit is not a common area surface. I have my deed here, recorded with the county assessor, and I am happy to pass it around. The board's interpretation of the governing documents is the operative interpretation in matters of community governance, Gerald Fitch said, with the careful tone of someone reading from a script he trusted completely. "Gerald, an interpretation that contradicts the plain language of the document is not an interpretation, it's a stretch," I said, and I heard a sound from the rows behind me that might have been a suppressed laugh. I would ask the board to point this community to the specific language that authorizes the permanent installation of signage on individually owned exterior surfaces. Not a broad principle, not a general authority, but specific language. Because I have read this document very carefully, and that language does not exist. Diane looked at me with the composed expression of someone who has decided that composure is itself a form of dominance. "The board has broad authority under the governing documents to act in the best interests of the community," she said. "That authority covers decisions about community appearance and safety that individual homeowners may not always agree with." "Broad authority does not mean unlimited authority," I said. "And I'd like to address the safety argument directly, because I think this community deserves to hear it clearly." I looked out at the rows of residents. The sign that the board installed on my garage wall is written almost entirely in Spanish. It faces the walking path that runs past my front door and the front doors of several other units. Its message in translation is that people who go through the trash bins are trespassers and that the police will be called. I paused. This community includes residents and their families who speak Spanish as a first language. That sign communicates to them, and to anyone who visits them, that this board considers Spanish-speaking people to be the presumptive source of a criminal problem. I find that offensive. I believe others in this room find it offensive. And I think the board needs to answer for that choice. The room shifted. It was not a loud shift, but it was a real one, the kind that happens when something has been said publicly that people had been thinking privately. Rosa Castellano stood up without waiting to be called on. "My name is Rosa Castellano. I'm in Unit 9, she said, and her voice was steady and clear. "My mother came to visit me last month, and she saw that sign on her way to my door. She asked me why the people in my neighborhood had put up a sign telling her she wasn't welcome here. My mother is 72 years old, and she has never gone through anyone's trash in her life. I would like the board to explain to me what she was supposed to think when she saw that." Diane looked at Rosa with an expression of careful sympathy that did not quite reach her eyes. "The sign was not directed at any individual or family," she said. "It was a community safety measure." "A community safety measure written in one language," Rosa said, and sat back down. Walter Simmons raised his hand from beside me. "Walter Simmons, Unit 13, he said. "I've lived here 11 years, and I've never seen a problem with the trash bins that warranted permanent signage on anyone's home. I'd like to know how many formal complaints the board received about this issue before they decided to install a sign, and I'd like to know why the board chose to put it on Dana's wall, specifically, rather than near the actual bin area." Diane looked at Gerald, who looked at his laptop. "The board received concerns from multiple residents," Gerald said carefully. "How many?" Walter said. Gerald looked at his laptop again. "The board's deliberations are confidential," he said. "The number of complaints you received is not a deliberation," Walter said, with a mildness that was somehow more pointed than anger would have been. "It's a fact." "How many complaints?" The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. Ron Busby leaned forward with the energy of someone rescuing a situation he could see slipping. "The board takes community concerns seriously regardless of the volume," he said. "Even one complaint about safety deserves a response." "One complaint," Pete Garland said from behind me, not quite a question. "I didn't say one," Ron said quickly. "You kind of did," Pete said. David Nguyen raised his hand from the back of the room. "David Nguyen, Unit 6, he said. "I want to be clear that my wife and I are here tonight because we believe a line was crossed when the board installed permanent hardware on a homeowner's property without notice or consent, regardless of what the sign said or what language it was in. If the board can do this to Dana's garage, they can do it to any of our homes. That concerns me as a property owner." "The board acted within its authority," Diane said, and there was a tightness around her words now that had not been there at the beginning of the meeting. "You keep saying that," I said from my seat and stood back up. "And every time someone asks you to show us where that authority is written down, the answer is broad authority and community standards and the board's interpretation. Diane, I am asking you one more time, in front of this entire community, to show me the specific language in our CC and RS that authorized what you did to my property." Diane looked at me steadily. "The board has consulted with the association's legal counsel and is confident in its position," she said. That was new. I filed it away. "Then the association's legal counsel should have no difficulty pointing to that specific language," I said. "I look forward to seeing it." "The fines on your account stand," Diane said, and her voice had gone from tight to flat, which in my experience of her was a sign that she had decided the conversation was over on her terms. "The board's decision stands. The board acted appropriately and in the best interests of this community, and we will not be revisiting that position this evening." Carol leaned over and said quietly into my ear, "Walt hasn't said a word all night." I glanced at the end of the table. Walt Crummer was sitting with his hands folded in front of him, looking at a spot on the table somewhere between himself and the room, and he had the expression of a man sitting through something he wished he could stop, but had decided he could not. "Walt," I said, looking at him directly, "is there anything you'd like to say?" The room went very still. Diane's eyes moved to Walt with the focused precision of a laser. Walt looked up at me, and then at the room, and then at his folded hands. "I think," he said slowly, that this situation could have been handled differently from the beginning. He stopped there, as though that were all he was prepared to offer, but it was enough that Ron Busby shifted in his seat and Gerald Fitch found something urgent to look at on his laptop screen. "Thank you, Walt," I said quietly. "The meeting will move on," Deanne said immediately, in a tone that left no room for anything else from anyone at that end of the table. I stood for a moment longer, looking at the four of them, and then I looked out at the residents who had come tonight, and I thanked them for being there. I gathered my folder and I pushed my chair in, and I walked to the door with Carol and Walter falling in behind me and Pete and Maria, a step after that, and Rosa and Eddie Castellano beside them. And I walked out into the night air with the sound of Diane calling the meeting back to order fading behind me. I drove home and walked the path to my front door, and stood in front of my clean garage wall for a long moment in the quiet. Then I went inside and sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop, and spent 20 minutes searching for attorneys in Los Angeles who specialized in homeowner association disputes and property rights. I found 3 whose records looked promising, wrote down their numbers, and went to bed. In the morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my folder and my list of 3 names, and at 8:59, I picked up the phone and called the first one. My attorney's name was Marcus Webb, and he had spent 17 years doing nothing but homeowner association law in Los Angeles, which meant he had seen everything the universe of petty institutional authority had to offer, and very little of it surprised him anymore. What happened when he opened my folder and spread the contents across his desk on that Friday morning was therefore notable, because Marcus Webb looked at the fine notices and the fee additions and the CC and RS and my deed, and the photographs of the sign and the written record of its return, and he leaned back in his chair and smiled the slow and genuine smile of a man who has just been handed exactly what he wanted for Christmas. "Tell me they have an attorney," he said. Diane mentioned at the HO a meeting that they had consulted with legal counsel, I told him. "Good," he said, which was not the response I had expected. He picked up the fine notice and read it again. They cited 7.4 and 12.1. "They did," I said. He set it down and looked at me. "Dana, Section 7.4 of your CC and RS was written by an attorney in 1987 to address the specific liability requirements around residential pool signage under California Health and Safety Code. It has one purpose and one application, and this is neither of them." He picked up the CC and RS and flipped to the tabbed page without needing to look for it. And 12.1 defines common area surfaces as those held in undivided interest by all members of the association. Your garage wall is within your recorded property boundary. It is not held in undivided interest by anyone. It is yours. He closed the document. They didn't just overreach. They cited the wrong sections entirely, which means either their attorney didn't read the documents or they didn't consult their attorney before they issued the fines. "Is that good for us?" I asked. "It is very good for us," he said, "because it suggests the fines were issued without proper legal review, which opens the door to a bad faith argument on top of everything else." He picked up the photograph of the sign. "Walk me through the language issue." I told him about the Spanish text, about Rosa Castellano's mother, about the board's response when the racial dimension was raised, about Diane's explanation that the language had been chosen based on the board's assessment of the situation. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he set the photograph down carefully. "The board put a sign on your property that identified a specific ethnic group as the presumptive source of a criminal problem, and when confronted about it, their president said the language was chosen based on their assessment," he said. "And this is all documented in meeting minutes." "The private meeting wasn't formally minuted," I said. "But the HO meeting was." "The HO meeting is enough," he said. He straightened the papers into a neat stack and looked at me with the focused calm of someone shifting from appreciation to planning. "Here is what we are going to file. We are filing for a declaration that the fines are invalid on the grounds that the cited sections do not apply to the conduct described. We are filing for recovery of all fines and fees assessed. We are filing for your legal costs on the grounds that the board's conduct was unreasonable and without proper legal basis. and we are adding a harassment claim based on the pattern of escalating financial penalties issued in response to your legitimate exercise of your property rights." He paused. "The racial dimension of the sign will be raised as evidence of the board's judgment and decision-making process. I want the judge to understand who these people are and how they think." "Do you think we can win all of it?" I asked. "I think they are going to settle," he said. "I think the moment their attorney reads our filing, he is going to call Diane Platt and tell her to write a check and apologize. But if they don't settle, then yes. I think we win all of it." They did not settle. Diane Platt, it turned out, was not a woman who settled. The case was assigned to Judge Patricia Harmon in the Los Angeles County Superior Court, and the hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in late February, 4 months after the sign had first appeared on my garage wall. Marcus had prepared me thoroughly, walking me through what to expect and what not to do, and reminding me more than once that my job in that courtroom was to be exactly what I had been throughout this entire process: calm, documented, and reasonable, and to let the record speak for itself. The HOA was represented by an attorney named Brian Sowell, a compact and somewhat harried-looking man who had the air of someone who had reviewed the file recently enough to understand the difficulty of his position, but not recently enough to have figured out what to do about it. He and Marcus exchanged the particular professional courtesies of opposing attorneys who have sized each other up and reached their conclusions, and then we all took our places and waited for Judge Harmon. Judge Patricia Harmon came to the bench with the efficiency of someone who had a full calendar and did not intend to waste any of it. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with reading glasses and a stillness about her that suggested she had heard every possible argument in every possible configuration and was prepared to hear them all again without it costing her anything. She reviewed the filing in silence for a moment, and then she looked up at Brian Sowell. "Counsel," she said, "before we begin, I want to make sure I understand the association's position." The association installed permanent metal hardware on the exterior surface of the plaintiff's privately owned unit without prior notice, without a homeowner vote, and without written consent, and the association's legal basis for doing so is broad authority under the governing documents. "Is that correct?" Brian Sowell stood. "That is substantially correct, Your Honor, with the caveat that the association maintains the exterior surfaces of townhouse units fall within its jurisdiction as common interest property under California Civil Code." "I have read the CC and RS, Judge Harmon said, in a tone that did not invite elaboration. "We'll proceed." Diane Platt was the first witness Brian Sowell called, and watching her take the stand was instructive. In a community room with a legal pad in front of her, she was formidable, controlled, and absolutely certain of herself. In a witness chair in a Los Angeles County courtroom, with a judge looking at her over reading glasses, she was something considerably less than that. She sat too straight, and her answers came slightly too quickly, the way answers come when someone has rehearsed them without fully understanding what they were rehearsing for. Marcus approached her with the relaxed and unhurried manner of a man on a pleasant walk. "Ms. Platt, you've served as president of the Callaway Court HOA board for 4 years. Is that correct?" he asked. "That's correct," Diane said. "And in that capacity, you are responsible for ensuring that board decisions are made in accordance with the community's governing documents," he said. "The board acts in accordance with its authority under the governing documents in California Civil Code," Diane said, with the practiced fluency that had served her well in community rooms and was already beginning to sound hollow in this one. "Can you show me, in the CC and RS, the specific provision that authorized the installation of permanent signage on the exterior wall of the plaintiff's garage?" Marcus said, placing a copy of the document in front of her. Diane looked at it. "The board has broad authority under Section 3.2 to act in the best interests of the community," she said. "Section 3.2, Marcus said, finding the page with the ease of someone who had read it many times. "Section 3.2 states that the board may take actions necessary for the maintenance and operation of common areas. Ms. Platt, is the exterior wall of the plaintiff's privately owned end-unit garage a common area, under the definition provided in Section 1.4 of these documents?" Diane looked at the document. "The exterior surfaces of attached units are subject to association oversight, she said. That is not what I asked, Marcus said pleasantly. Section 1.4 defines common areas as those parcels of land and improvements held in undivided interest by all members of the association. Is the plaintiff's garage wall held in undivided interest by all members of the association? Diane was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. The board's legal interpretation, she began. Yes or no, Miss Platt, Marcus said still pleasantly. The situation is more nuanced than a yes or no answer, Diane said. I'll take that as a no, Marcus said, and moved on before Brian Sowell's objection was fully out of his mouth. He asked her about the language of the sign, and this was where Diane Platt, who had handled every previous version of this conversation with the smooth confidence of someone who had decided the question, was beneath serious consideration, began to come apart in the small and visible ways that witnesses come apart when they realize the room is not on their side. The sign was written primarily in Spanish, Marcus said. Whose decision was that? It was a board decision, Diane said. Was it discussed at a board meeting? He asked. Board discussions are confidential, she said. The minutes of your board meetings are part of the record in this case, Marcus said. The minutes of the meeting at which the sign was approved contain 11 lines. The language of the sign is not mentioned in any of them. Can you explain why the board chose to write the sign almost entirely in Spanish, without any documented discussion of that choice? Diane looked at Brian Sowell and then back at Marcus. The board used its judgment, she said. The board used its judgment, Marcus repeated. And that judgment was that the people most likely to go through the trash bins in this community were Spanish-speaking people. That is not what I said, Diane said sharply. Then please tell the court what the board's judgment was, Marcus said. The silence that followed was the worst possible answer Diane Platt could have given, and she gave it for 4 full seconds before she said that the sign was intended to communicate effectively with the relevant population, which was in some ways even worse than silence. Judge Harmon looked up from her notes. Gerald Fitch took the stand next and testified with the careful vagueness of a man who had decided that specificity was dangerous. He described the board's authority in broad terms, cited sections that Marcus then read aloud in their entirety to demonstrate they did not say what Gerald suggested they said, and at one point described the plaintiff's garage wall as quasi-common property, a phrase that caused Judge Harmon to remove her reading glasses and look at him with an expression that required no translation. Quasi-common, she said. In the sense that it is part of an attached structure, Gerald said. Counsel, the judge said to Brian Sowell, is quasi-common a legal term I should be familiar with? No, Your Honor, Brian Sowell said, with the resignation of a man who had known this day was going to be long. Ron Busby contradicted Gerald Fitch twice without appearing to notice he was doing it. First about the number of complaints the board had received regarding the trash bins, which he put at several and which Gerald had earlier described as a number of, and then about whether the board had consulted legal counsel before installing the sign, which Ron said they had and which Gerald had implied they had not. And the gap between those two accounts sat in the middle of the courtroom, like something none of them could explain away. Walt Crummer was the last board member to testify, and he sat in the witness chair with the expression of a man who had decided that the time for going along with things had passed. Marcus approached him with the same unhurried manner he brought to everything. Mr. Crummer, were you personally comfortable with the board's decision to install the sign on the plaintiff's garage wall without providing her with prior notice? He asked. Walt looked at his hands and then at Marcus. No, he said. I was not. The word landed in the courtroom with the particular weight of a simple, honest answer in a proceeding that had contained very few of them. Did you raise that concern with the other board members? Marcus asked. I raised it, Walt said. It was not received well. Did you believe, at the time the decision was made, that the board had clear legal authority under the CC and RS to install permanent signage on the plaintiff's property? Marcus asked. Walt was quiet for a moment. I was not certain that we did, he said. I said so. We moved forward anyway. Brian Sowell's cross-examination of Walt Crummer was brief and did not improve anything. Marcus's closing argument was 22 minutes long and covered the property rights violation, the improper citation of inapplicable CC and R sections, the pattern of escalating financial penalties that had no basis in the governing documents, and the racial dimension of the sign in language that was precise and unflinching, and that filled the courtroom with the particular discomfort of something being said that everyone present knew needed to be said. He asked the court to declare the fines invalid, order their full return, award legal fees, and find that the board's conduct constituted harassment of a homeowner for the legitimate exercise of her property rights. Brian Sowell's closing argument was also 22 minutes long and considerably less effective. Judge Harmon did not take long. She returned from recess after 40 minutes and settled at the bench and put on her reading glasses and looked at the courtroom over them before she began. "This case," she said, "is not complicated. The association installed a permanent fixture on the plaintiff's privately owned property without notice, without consent, and without any specific authority in the governing documents to do so. The sections cited in the subsequent fine notices do not describe the conduct for which the plaintiff was fined. The escalating fees added to the original fine in the weeks following the plaintiff's formal dispute represent a pattern of financial pressure that this court finds to be retaliatory in nature." She paused and looked at the documents in front of her. "The court fines entirely for the plaintiff. The fines and all associated fees are declared invalid and are to be returned in full within 30 days. The association is ordered to pay the plaintiff's legal fees in their entirety. The court further finds that the board's conduct throughout this matter, from the initial installation to the management of the subsequent dispute, constitutes harassment of a homeowner for the exercise of her legitimate property rights, and the plaintiff is awarded damages in the amount of $8,000. The room was very quiet. Judge Harmon was not finished. She set down one page and picked up another, and the shift in her expression was the shift of someone moving from a legal ruling to something she intended to say on her own authority. "The court wishes to address one additional matter," she said. The sign at the center of this dispute was written almost entirely in Spanish. The association's stated justification for this choice was that it represented the board's judgment about the relevant population. This court finds that reasoning to be discriminatory in its premise and deeply problematic in its application. Identifying a specific language group as the presumptive source of a community problem, and then permanently affixing that identification to a private homeowner's residence without her knowledge or consent, reflects a standard of judgment that this court finds troubling. She looked directly at the table where the board sat. The court is not in a position to mandate personnel decisions within a private homeowners association. However, this court strongly suggests that the Callaway Court HO board reflect carefully on whether the leadership that produced this decision continues to serve the best interests of this community. Specifically, this court strongly suggests that Ms. Platt consider whether her continued leadership of this board is in the community's best interest. The silence in the courtroom after that was a different kind of silence than the one that had followed the ruling. It was the silence of something having been said by someone, with the authority to say it in a way that could not be smoothed over or redirected or subjected to a board vote. Diane Platt sat completely still at the defense table and said nothing, which was the first time in my experience of her that she had nothing to say. I drove home in the late afternoon light and parked and walked the path around the corner the way I did every day, past the birds of paradise and the trimmed boxwood, and the quiet that I had always loved about this particular corner of Lowe's Angels. I stopped in front of my garage and stood there for a moment in the warmth of the February sun. The wall was smooth and clean, and exactly the color it was supposed to be, and there was nothing on it but the light. I stood there long enough to feel the 6 months of it, the anger and the preparation and the meetings and the courtroom and all the notices in my folder, and then I took a slow breath of the warm afternoon air and went inside and made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where this had all begun, and I thought that sometimes the right thing to do and the winning thing to do turn out to be exactly the same thing. It does not always work out that way, but sometimes it does.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. to encourage us to make more videos. Please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share.